We're here because you're selfish, ungrateful, and tearing this family apart. My mother said that into a microphone in my parents' living room on my 30th birthday. 40 people sat in folding chairs staring at me while my father held a 3-page list of everything I'd done wrong since I was 8, and my sister aimed her phone at my face. Live on TikTok. I didn't cry and I didn't leave. I just sat there, waited for them to finish, and then I said 6 words that changed everything. Funny. I've been recording too. What happened in the next 11 minutes ended 6 relationships in that room, and my sister deleted her entire TikTok before she even made it to the car. My name is Faith, a 30-year-old ER nurse in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, and this is the story of how my family threw me a surprise intervention for my birthday, and how it became the worst night in Mercer family history. To understand how we got there, let me take you back 3 months before that night to the phone call I was never supposed to hear. My life before everything fell apart was a constant cycle of sacrifice that I never questioned. I'd just finished a 14-hour shift in the ER, dealing with car accidents, a cardiac arrest, and a kid who swallowed a quarter, when I sat in my car smelling like iodine and coffee, checking my phone for the usual demands. There were messages from my mom about an insurance bill, my older sister Kristen wanting $400 for a branding course, and a photo of a roofing invoice from my dad. I did the math I did every month: mortgage for my parents, mom's health insurance supplement, Kristen's car payment, and groceries, totaling roughly $2,100 a month. That was nearly half my take-home pay, leaving me with a 1-bedroom apartment filled with IKEA furniture and a 2014 Civic with 130,000 miles. I hadn't taken a vacation in 8 years because my grandmother Ruth taught me that family takes care of family, and I never complained. I just didn't realize the difference between taking care of someone and being taken from. But I was about to find out because the money I'd been sending wasn't going where I thought. The illusion shattered 3 months before my birthday on a Tuesday evening when I stopped by my parents' house to pick up a jacket I'd left behind. I stepped inside the unlocked back door and heard my mother and Kristen in the kitchen, glowing as they discussed Kristen's TikTok personal brand. But then the conversation shifted to me, and my hand froze on the door frame. "We do it on her birthday," my mother said. "Everyone's already coming. We sit her down and we tell her she's selfish and controls us with money." Kristen laughed, saying she'd film the whole thing because it was exactly the kind of raw, real family content her page needed. When Kristen hesitated, asking what if I stopped paying, my mother laughed with a short, confident sound, saying I'd been paying for 8 years and wouldn't stop now. She explained that if 40 people watched them beg me for help and I walked away, I'd just be proving their point, that I was the one abandoning them. I stood there for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, my pulse in my ears and my legs feeling hollow, before backing out through the door without making a sound. I stood in the driveway for 20 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the garage door before calling my best friend Naomi, a civil rights attorney, who listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she asked if I still had the voice recorder app from a malpractice scare the year before, and her advice was simple: keep it and start using it, because I didn't plan revenge that night. I planned survival. Over the next few days, I made a list of consequences, realizing that if the intervention happened and I just sat there, 40 people, including my supervisor Marcus and colleagues from the ER, would walk out believing I was the selfish daughter tearing her family apart. In a small town, reputation is currency, and my mother was about to bankrupt mine by inviting my work friends to show support, which was really just a trap to ensure I couldn't fight back without looking like the villain they claimed I was. Naomi reminded me that Ohio is a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was part of, so the plan stopped being about survival and started being about the truth. I started recording every Sunday dinner, and while the first week was quiet, the second week revealed a side of my father I never knew existed. I was at the kitchen sink rinsing plates when I heard his voice from the garage, speaking in a soft, light tone like a teenager talking to his first girlfriend. He was on the phone with a woman named Linda, confirming a Tuesday meeting while my mother was at Bible study, laughing that after 22 years, she still believed he went bowling on Tuesdays. I gripped the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles went white, catching a plate just before it smashed. realizing that my phone was catching everything. A few weeks later, I arrived early and heard my mother on speakerphone with my Aunt Jeanette through an open bedroom window, discussing how they had hidden $14,000 from my grandmother's estate sale in a personal account my father didn't know about. They laughed about selling Grandma Ruth's pearl bracelet for $800 and planning to lie to her about it being at the jeweler, all while I was eating meal prep out of plastic containers to pay their mortgage. By the time my birthday approached, the recordings in my phone had become a folder I labeled Insurance, containing evidence of my father's affair, my mother's theft from my grandmother, and my sister Kristen's true feelings about her husband Derek. I listened to Kristen call Derek useless and wished she'd never married him, only to watch her act sweet to his face 10 minutes later. Every person in my family wore a mask, and I was the only one who didn't, not anymore. 10 days before the big night, Naomi and I sat in her car setting ground rules. I would walk in like it was a normal party, let them talk all the way through without interrupting, and only if they refused to speak privately would I press play. Naomi handed me a small Bluetooth speaker, telling me that once I rang that bell, there was no going back to normal. But as I looked at the 4 files lined up on my screen, I realized that normal was never good. Normal was me being bled dry while they planned my public humiliation. The Saturday morning before my birthday, I drove 40 minutes to Maple Ridge, the assisted living facility where Grandma Ruth lives, finding her by the window working a crossword puzzle in pen. We did what we always do, shared butterscotch candies and watched Wheel of Fortune. But the air felt different when she asked about my mother's plans for my 30th birthday. I stayed quiet as her paper-thin but firm hand squeezed mine, and she told me that while Mercer women are loud, the strong ones are quiet. Then she asked about her pearl bracelet, mentioning that Aunt Jeanette was supposed to bring it for cleaning months ago, and it hadn't turned up. I swallowed hard, knowing the truth about that $800 sale I'd heard on my recording, but I couldn't bring myself to break her heart just yet. When I left, she sent me a text full of typos that I read 3 times in my car. Whatever they do tonight, remember who raised you on Saturdays. I am proud of you always. That evening, Naomi came over to my apartment with takeout and the Bluetooth speaker, walking me through the logistics one last time, and reminding me that once I pressed play, my father's affair and my mother's theft would be out in the open forever. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared, but because I was done rehearsing while my family built a courtroom in their living room. At 2 a.m., I sat in the dark with my earbuds in, listening to the 4 files in my insurance folder, my dad's careless laugh with Linda, my mom and Jeanette bragging about the $14,000, Kristen calling Derek useless, and finally, the recording of my mother planning to humiliate me on my birthday for content. I realized they had written the charges, invited the witnesses, and even hired a camera crew, my own sister, to live stream my trial for strangers on the internet. They had no idea the defendant had more to say than anyone in that room wanted to hear. Turning 30 didn't feel like a celebration or a beginning. It felt like a verdict. But as I plugged my phone in and set my alarm, I knew the verdict wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was theirs. The next evening, I pulled into my parents' driveway at 6:15 and counted 12 cars lining the street, realizing this was far more than a surprise party. My phone was charged, the app was open, and the speaker was paired as I smoothed my blouse and walked through the front door into a living room that had been transformed into a lecture hall. The couch was shoved against the wall, replaced by 4 rows of folding chairs, facing a microphone on a chrome tripod, and behind it hung a butcher paper banner that read, "We love you enough to tell the truth." I scanned the room and saw 40 faces, including my supervisor Marcus, my colleague Carla, Dr. Pham, and neighbors I'd known since childhood. In the far corner, Kristen stood behind a tripod with her phone mounted and the red dot blinking. She was live. I looked at the one empty chair in the front row, center stage, and I sat down. My mother stepped up to the microphone in her good church blouse, smiling that practiced warm smile, and told the room that as a family, they had decided it was time to be honest. My mother pulled a folded sheet of paper from her pocket and began to read, her voice filled with practiced tenderness as she told the room I was selfish, cold, and used money as a weapon to control the family. She claimed I was tearing everyone apart and that Sunday dinners had become tense because of my attitude. conveniently omitting the fact that I was the one paying for the food on the table and the roof over her head. The room was dead quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of a folding chair as my supervisor Marcus and my colleagues from the ER watched my mother publicly dissect my character. She insisted they weren't doing this to hurt me, but because nobody else had the courage to tell me the truth. Then my father stood up, reaching into his shirt pocket for 3 pages of lined paper covered in my mother's handwriting. He read a list of my patterns since I was 8 years old. Broken windows I didn't break, church camps I didn't want to attend, and the fact that I moved out at 22 without permission, scraping my childhood off a bone and holding it under a fluorescent light for 40 people to judge. He finished by saying they had raised me better than this and sat down, leaving the weight of his words to settle in the silence of the room. I let 10 seconds pass, letting every person feel the gravity of what had just happened, before I stood up and asked as calmly as possible if we could discuss this privately as a family. My mother immediately shook her head, claiming that I always shut them down in private and that these people were witnesses to the intervention. I looked around the room, at Marcus typing on his phone, at the Bible study friends nodding along, and at Kristen behind her tripod, still live streaming my humiliation to her followers. Derek, Kristen's husband, looked confused and uncomfortable, while Naomi sat in the back row with her hand resting on her open purse where the speaker was waiting. I took a deep breath, the same one I take before calling a time of death in the ER, realizing that this wasn't an end, but a beginning that couldn't be taken back. I opened my purse, pulled out my phone, and held it up so the entire room could see it, telling them it was funny because I'd been recording too. The room went absolutely silent as I pressed play, and the Bluetooth speaker in Naomi's purse came alive with my father's voice filling the room, talking to Linda about their Tuesday meetings while my mother was at Bible study. His laugh, light and careless, echoed through the living room as he talked about how my mother still believed he went bowling after 22 years. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating as my mother's face drained of color, turning to my father with a look of utter betrayal. My father lunged forward, telling me to turn it off, but I didn't move as the recording continued with him promising to bring Linda dinner from the Italian place she liked. A woman in a green cardigan stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out without a word, followed quickly by her friend as the first relationship in the room began to shatter in real time. I stopped the first recording and looked at the room, my voice as even and calm as a chart note, telling them that there were 3 more files to go. Nobody breathed or moved as the banner behind me, which claimed they loved me enough to tell the truth, became a cruel irony. I pressed play on the second file, and this time my mother's voice filled the room, confident and conspiratorial as she bragged to Aunt Jeanette about hiding $14,000 from Grandma Ruth's estate sale in a personal account my father knew nothing about. Jeanette's voice, small and sharp through the speaker, called it smart and mentioned she'd already sold Grandma's pearl bracelet for $800, suggesting they just tell her it was at the jeweler for cleaning. My father, already reeling from the exposure of his affair, turned to my mother with a face full of fury, demanding to know about the money he'd been told only brought in $4,000 total. Aunt Jeanette bolted to her feet as the room erupted in whispered disbelief, and another of my mother's Bible study friends stood up, clutching her purse and looking at my mother with a face full of revised judgment before walking out the door. I didn't wait for the murmurs to die down before pressing play on the third file, which featured Kristen's voice, slurred from wine, calling her husband Derek useless because he couldn't fix a sink or get a promotion. She admitted she wished she had never said yes at the altar and claimed she only stayed because she got pregnant that first year, while my mother's voice in the background agreed that she could have done better. The audio was pristine, catching every bitter breath, and I watched Derek, who had been sitting quietly in the second row, go perfectly still with a look of recognition that was far more chilling than shock. He stood up slowly, not looking at me or anyone else, but staring directly at Kristen, whose face had completely collapsed in terror. He didn't say a word. He simply walked down the center aisle and out the front door, the soft click of it closing sounding louder than anything else that night. Kristen lunged for her tripod, frantically trying to delete the live stream and the evidence of the night she had created, but the damage was already done and preserved in the cloud. The final recording was the one that had started it all, the one that proved this entire night wasn't an intervention, but a scripted performance. My mother's voice from 3 months ago detailed the plan to do it on my birthday and make me look selfish, suggesting that if I cried, it would only prove I couldn't handle the truth. Kristen's voice added that her social media page needed this kind of raw family content, and my mother concluded that if I threatened to stop paying the mortgage, they would tell everyone I was abandoning my family because I wouldn't risk the public shame. When the recording ended, I let the silence hold as 40 people finally saw the actual truth of who was selfish in this family. Marcus, my supervisor, picked up his phone and put it in his pocket with a look of total recalculation, while my father sat slumped in his chair and my mother stood alone at the front of the room, the microphone still on its stand like a monument to something that had just died. I lowered my phone and simply said that now everyone knew the truth, and it wasn't me who was the problem. The living room looked like the aftermath of a disaster, with Kristen running out after Derek, Aunt Jeanette staring at the carpet in shame, and my parents standing on opposite sides of the room, separated by the weight of a 22-year lie and $14,000 stolen dollars. I put my phone back in my purse and stood straight, addressing the room without raising my voice, stating clearly so there would be no confusion that starting tonight, I was no longer paying the mortgage, the insurance premiums, or Kristen's car payments. I told them I had already set up the auto cancellation for every recurring transfer to be effective by midnight, which caused my mother's head to snap toward me in shock, as she claimed they depended on me. I looked her in the eyes and reminded her that she had just spent 30 minutes telling 40 people how terrible I was, so I was simply giving her exactly what she asked for. A life without my supposed selfishness. A cousin in the back let out a low whistle of disbelief, and Carla, my friend from work, nodded quietly as my mother tried to argue that I was overreacting. But I pointed out that I had asked to talk privately, and they had chosen this public stage instead. I turned to Naomi, who stood up and looped her purse over her shoulder, and together we walked toward the door as I thanked everyone for coming and apologized that it wasn't the party they expected. Just as I was 3 steps from leaving, my supervisor Marcus stood up in the aisle and looked at me with a steady, professional gaze that I'd seen him use during the most intense shifts at the hospital. He told the entire room that he had worked with me for 6 years and had seen me hold a dying man's hand at 3 a.m. and chart his vitals at 3:15 without missing a beat, declaring that he knew exactly who I was. He stated clearly that this night changed nothing at the hospital, except that his respect for me had just gone up, a verdict that landed with immense weight in the silent room. Carla grabbed her coat and insisted on driving me home so I wouldn't be alone, and as I passed my mother on the way out, she grabbed my sleeve, her fingers trembling as she whispered my name. I gently pulled my sleeve free, looking at her one last time and telling her that while she had a microphone, I had a phone, and the only difference was that mine told the truth. I walked out the front door and closed it gently with a click, feeling a strange, heavy relief as I checked my phone on the porch and saw a text from Grandma Ruth that had been sent 2 hours earlier. She had gone to bed early but wished me a happy birthday, calling me the best of us and reminding me to remember who raised me on Saturdays. I pressed the phone against my chest and stood in the cool Ohio air until Carla pulled her car around, and as we drove toward my apartment with Naomi in the back seat, the only sound was the tires on wet asphalt and the low hum of the heater. When I finally read Grandma Ruth's text out loud, Carla's hands tightened on the wheel and Naomi made a sound of quiet support, telling me that my grandma had clearly raised me right, and the rest of them were just noise. We pulled into my apartment complex, and for the first time in 8 years, the place felt entirely mine, without the burden of calculating how much I owed everyone else. I dropped my purse on the counter, opened my banking app, and canceled the mortgage, insurance, and car payments one by one, finally sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark and listening to a silence that didn't feel empty at all. Monday morning, the day after the intervention, the fallout began in earnest when my father moved out of the house without a word, packing a single duffel bag and driving to a friend's place, while my mother was at the grocery store. She called me 14 times that day, her desperation vibrating through the phone, but I didn't pick up because I realized I finally had nothing left to say to the woman who had scripted my public shaming. By the 3rd day, Kristen called me sobbing so hard I could barely understand her, screaming that Derek had filed for legal separation, changed the locks on their home, and refused to speak to her at all. When she tried to blame me for ruining her marriage, I simply told her that she had ruined it herself in that kitchen 6 weeks ago, and that I had only been the one to press play on the truth she had created. By the end of the week, the news of Grandma Ruth's stolen bracelet had rippled through the entire extended family after a cousin confronted Aunt Jeanette, who finally admitted she had spent the $800. Even my mother's social media presence, the thing she valued most, became a ghost town after she posted a long, emotional plea for prayers and grace that received 0 likes and 0 comments from the friends who had watched her mask slip. A month passed, and the dust didn't settle so much as it rearranged itself into a new, quieter reality, where I finally sat down with my banking app and a cup of coffee to do the math I should have done years ago. With the $2,100 a month I was no longer sending home, I was able to pay off the remaining $3,800 of my student loans in just 6 weeks, a debt I thought would follow me for another decade. For the first time in my life, at 30 years old, I opened a retirement account and set up an auto deposit for my own future, a small but monumental act of self-preservation that felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater. I booked a proper flight to visit Grandma Ruth, staying in a hotel nearby so I could spend long, unhurried mornings with her without the constant pressure of rushing back to a life that wasn't mine. At the hospital, the atmosphere had shifted in a way I hadn't expected. Marcus didn't treat me with pity, but with a new level of trust, assigning me to the trauma protocol committee and signaling that my professional reputation was stronger than my mother's attempts to dismantle it. Carla and I started having lunch every Wednesday, talking about normal, easy things like her daughter's soccer games and my grandma's crossword addiction, building a friendship that wasn't based on what I could do for her, but on who I actually was. I even went to the hardware store and bought a small pothos plant for $5, placing it on the kitchen counter where my phone used to sit, while I calculated my family's debts, a tiny green symbol of my new independence. When Naomi texted me to ask how freedom tasted, I sent her a photo of that plan, and we shared a laugh through our screens that felt like the final seal on my old life. 6 weeks after the intervention, I walked out of a double shift at the hospital and found my mother standing by my car, arms folded and shivering in the cold, still trying to claim that she was my mother and I couldn't just cut her off. I looked at her, tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, and explained that I hadn't cut her off. I had only cut off the money, and that if she truly loved me, she would see the difference. When she refused to apologize, claiming she did it all out of care, I simply told her we were done for now, got into my car, and left her standing there as she got smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. I cried on the drive home that night, not from regret, but from the profound sense of loss that comes when you finally realize that loving someone and accepting their abuse are 2 different things. I chose love, but I simply stopped accepting the rest. And as the months turned into a year, the wreckage of my family's choices settled into a permanent new landscape. My parents officially separated, with my father moving into a tiny 1-bedroom apartment and discovering that Linda, his Tuesday distraction, had a husband and a mortgage of her own, and wanted nothing to do with his real-life drama. Kristen and Derek finalized their divorce 3 months later, leaving Kristen to move back in with my mother in a silent 3-bedroom house where they had nothing left to say to each other. Aunt Jeanette was forced to face Grandma Ruth, who demanded either the pearl bracelet or the $800, and since Jeanette had neither, the rest of the family essentially stopped speaking to her. My mother still texts me occasionally, saying she's thinking of me, but there is no schedule, no obligation, and most importantly, no autopay. The truth didn't destroy my family. It only dissolved the glue of lies that I had been forced to provide for 8 years. Now, at 31, I still work as an ER nurse and drive my old Civic. Though I finally fixed the cracked windshield and the containers in my refrigerator are high-quality glass instead of cheap plastic, I realize that boundaries aren't walls designed to keep people out, but doors that allow you to decide who walks through and under what terms, and that is not cruelty. It is clarity. My grandmother's text message, which I've read hundreds of times, reminded me that strength doesn't have to be loud, and that loving someone doesn't mean you let them bleed you dry and then blame you for the stain. I used to think standing up for myself meant shouting or making a scene, But now I know it can be as simple as sitting quietly in a folding chair while 40 people stare at you, waiting calmly for your turn to speak. When that turn finally comes, you don't have to yell. You just have to be brave enough to press play and let the truth speak for itself. Last week, I celebrated my 31st birthday in my own apartment with Naomi, Carla, and a few close friends from the hospital, eating lemon cake with cream cheese frosting, the kind Grandma Ruth always ordered for me. There were no microphones, no 3-page lists of my faults, and no cameras pointed at my face. Just 6 people laughing while my grandmother sang happy birthday off-key over FaceTime. As I blew out the crooked candles, I realized that the best gift I ever gave myself was the truth. And the second best was the silence that followed the noise of my old life. I washed the dishes after everyone left, standing at the sink in my quiet apartment with my $5 plant on the counter, feeling a deep sense of peace. My name is Faith Mercer, and for the first time in a very long time, I actually like the woman I've become, a woman who finally learned that the sound of her own life is the most beautiful thing she has ever heard.